do you know what you're actually looking at? I mean, I don't know. I'm not being offensive with that, but is the, you know, I mean, the statements are made there about qualified professionals looking across these things to be able to give a judgment call.
Yeah, I understand the point you're making, but I'm not sure that I can recommend that the council employs different people to the ones it presently does, and they might be a bit cross with me if I tried to. It's an issue about the soundness of the plan. I mean, it does then, as what you're pointing out, I think, is that it doesn't matter what policies you have in the plan, you need to have people there who are capable of ensuring that they're properly implemented. I think that's sort of where you're going. That's, for me, a step too far, because we are only charged with looking at the legal compliance and soundness of the local plan. If it were adopted tomorrow, what the council then does or doesn't do with it is a matter for them, and not something that we frankly can do anything about.
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult, Simon, because, you know, there is a lot of crossover. I was talking there about MPPF 96 and 97 there, and that's a legal, you know, MPPF again is a legal requirement, and there must be something to be able to support that, otherwise it's a pointless in having it.
So can I just make one point, that the issue as to who and for what purpose the council employs people is a resources issue and a political issue. It doesn't go to the soundness of the plan, and if I might respectfully endorse what you've just said, if, when the policies come to be applied, someone thinks they're not being applied lawfully because the proper consultants haven't been engaged to deal with a specific issue, that's a matter to deal with the specific legalities of the decision when it's made, but it doesn't go to the soundness of the plan with respect.
Thank you. Mr. Schiff, you'd say something?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have a number of points to make. I mean, just quickly to say that we have submitted a detailed response to the local plan in our response of April 2018, in which we go through the transport policies and other policies in depth and point out where we think that they, you know, shortcomings and proposed remedies. So I don't want to go through all that, but just really picking up on what the council have said there. I mean, I don't, with all due respect, I don't think that the suggestion that climate change runs through these proposals, so the local plan, is remotely credible. Mr. Dennis touched on the Committee for Climate Change, which is surely the pertinent body here. They have set carbon budgets which, to enable the UK to reduce its carbon emissions by at least 100% of 1990 levels by 2050. And as the Committee for Climate Change recently, so for example, there are basically two remaining carbon budgets. One is the fourth carbon budget, 23 to 27, which requires a 51% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2025, and the fifth carbon budget, which is requires a 57% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And its most recent update to Parliament, I think it was in April 2019, or maybe it's October 2019, the Committee for Climate Change has said that the UK is not on course to meet those two carbon budgets. And it has also been, it also notes that transport is the one sector where greenhouse gas emissions have actually increased relative to 1990 emissions. And as the kind of Committee for Climate Change has said, most of the savings have come from electricity generation, and the challenging measures are going to have to be adopted, obviously, in the transport sector, where greenhouse gas emissions are increasing. And so, and as I've already touched on briefly, but also in our detailed response, there is no evidence. I mean, if the City of York Council has tried to encourage reduction of greenhouse gas emissions through the transport policies contained. The transport topic paper, for example, basically operates on a predict and provide approach of they think there'll be more housing, they think that people will drive, and the only way to and the thing to do is to accommodate that demand by dualling the outer ring road. But the facts are that 99.9%, this is DVLA statistics that were released in April 2019, 99.9% of cars on York's roads are fossil fuel powered, and they will generate significant carbon emissions. Furthermore, a report recently by the UK Energy Research Centre, which is an interdisciplinary UK government-funded organisation, has pointed out that for every one electric vehicle that has been bought, 37 SUVs have been bought, and SUVs have they emit 25% more carbon emissions per kilometre than a medium-sized car. So it is not enough to just try to kind of install a charging network if York residents continue to buy carbon-intensive cars, and therefore encouraging cars as dualling of the outer ring road will just result in a significant carbon footprint, which will mean that York will contribute to the breaching of the carbon budgets which will ensure that it cannot meet its requirements under the Climate Change Act. I just want to also add briefly, Pete Davis, in his previous response to my point on the sustainability appraisal, said that assessing likely carbon emissions is a very complex subject and is apparently, too complex to do. But that is, with all due respect, again, not true. I would invite Mr. Davis to refer to the Council's air quality reports that it submits every year to DEFRA, using DEFRA-provided toolkits like the emissions forecast toolkits. And in those reports, the Council sets out vehicle movements, like the expected composition of the vehicle fleets, and it uses all that data to come up with air quality forecasts. Air quality, so for example, air pollution is clearly correlated with carbon emissions. So if they can do it for air pollution forecasts, they can clearly do it for carbon emissions, because all the data is the same. DVLA, DFT, DEFRA, etc. They have all the data they need. So yes, I mean, I don't think there is any evidence that the local plan has put climate change at the heart of its its policies, as was suggested. And they most certainly do have the means to do a proper quantitative assessment of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff, for that. I don't see anybody else is wanting to comment on that. Does the Council have anything further to add in terms of anything that's been said?
I've already given you references in the sustainability appraisal to air quality and those other matters, and I don't propose to go over those again. The one thing I would simply say is a lot of what's just been said relates to national policy and national initiatives. That's not a matter for this plan. And you'll both be well aware of this, that despite the net zero recommendations of the Climate Change Committee, those matters have yet to be legislated or translated directly into national policy. We've had the amendment to the Climate Change Act to set the 2015 target, but the first piece of legislation which is going through was stalled as a result of the dissolution of Parliament, i.e. the Environment Bill. So we are left implementing government policy as it currently stands. If there are other national measures that come in due course, then they'll have to be complied with if they're legal requirements. But we are dealing with matters as they stand today. And emerging national policy, whilst very important, no doubt, is not a matter which is yet to translate into a legislative requirement, and no doubt that will be considered in due course as and when it is. And just for the avoidance of doubt, York City Council takes climate change very seriously. It's one of the authorities that declared a climate emergency earlier this year.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Anderson, is it? Sorry.
Again, I wasn't going to speak on this item, but the last comment has provoked me. You can't get out of it like that. The biggest site in this programme is York Central. Planning permission was granted for York Central by the council, despite huge complaints from a range of organisations about the dependence on the car and the overdevelopment of the site, which is actually the epicentre of poor air quality and traffic congestion in York. And there's been no attempt by the council and its partners to reduce the carbon impact, and to say, as Mr. Elvis just has, that this is a national policy issue is just straightforward nonsense. And
That's not what I was saying at all.
Sorry, can you let me finish,
No,
please?
well, Mr. Clark, you're addressing a point that hasn't been raised.
Sorry, can you let me finish?
Well, Mr.
Thank
Clark,
you. I didn't speak during
Thank you,
your speech.
thank you very much. I'll hear what Mr. Clark has to say first of all, Mr. Irving, and then I'll come to you.
The idea that large local authorities don't have a large amount of control over the emission, the carbon emissions and other environmental impacts in areas is simply not true. And the biggest site in this local plan, which is right in the centre of the city, there has not been a serious attempt by the council and its partners to hit the targets which have most recently been adopted. And I stand by every statement there, and there were no changes made to the application as a result of the protests made by my organisation and several other significant local organisations.
Thank you. Would you like to
I'm
comment?
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Mr. Clark. I do apologise. I'm afraid the cold has gone to my head, literally. That wasn't the point I was making. You understood the point was in relation to what had been said by the previous speaker in relation to lack of electric vehicles versus higher emission vehicles, those sort of things. I was directing that point to that.
Okay, thank you. Don't think nobody else indicating they wish to speak. Does the council have anything else that they wish to say on the climate change matters in conclusion? No? Very good. In that case, we'll move on to the next question, which is, does the plan comply with all relevant legal requirements, including the 2004 Act as amended and the 2012 regulations? Again, if we could start with the council, if they wish to make a brief gambit on that.
I think, other than the HRA issue, and I see Mr. Bewley looking expectant, we've set out our position in our statement of compliance. We consider there has been compliance, and I think the only significant issue outstanding is the issue between ourselves and DIO. Others may take a different view, but I don't propose to elaborate at this stage.
Very good, thank you. We'll move on to that. In that case then, I have nothing further on that. We can then move on to the Habitats Regulations Assessment. Sorry, oh, sorry, I didn't see it. Sorry. Sorry, Mr. Wright.
That was a close call.
I did say before the break.
You did indeed.
I wish to speak to this question.
You did say. Apologies.
So I will offer you an apology in exchange, and that is that when we reviewed the material that I'd submitted in the original response, we discovered that the spell check on my computer system was correcting things in Spanish. So there's some rather strange words in there, but that is the explanation.
I'm tempted, Mr. Wright, to say that had no bearing on our translation of what you'd said.
So I made my responses, as I did my comments in the hearing statement, in accordance with the RTPI protocol. I do not sit here having any proposal to promote any site for development or protect any site for any other land interest. My view is that I, through my professional knowledge and experience, wish to ensure that this local plan is legally compliant and sound. With regard to my submissions on legal compliance, I have discussed my arguments with specialist leading planning counsel since I submitted the hearing statement. I'm not going to repeat what I put in my hearing statement. You have it, and I'm sure it's hopefully clear, but if it's not, I will answer questions. I do want to make a reference to a statement that has been put in, a hearing statement that's been put in relation to Greenbelt by Catherine Jenkins of Dukes of Direction Planning. At her paragraph 3.2, she indicates that she was a former employee of the government office. And in that regard, she says the intention of government office when it dealt with the RSS policy was blah, blah. So it is quite clear that the intention of the author of a policy is not a matter for you to consider at all under any circumstances. The policy has to be considered at its face value for what it says. And in any event, the policy that is relevant to the regional strategy applicable to this plan is a policy that was written by the Secretary of State at the time of the revocation order. So he took a fresh look at the key diagram and decided that that key diagram represented what he wanted to convey in his trimmed down version of the RSS policy when it was reserved or saved in the revocation order. I consider that from the issue of legal compliance, that the appropriate order of matters that you need to have regard to is that firstly and foremost, section 24.1, which is the issue of being in general conformity with the regional strategy. This is a very unusual case. In most cases in the past, when you have had to address the question of being in general conformity with a regional strategy, you have been looking at a regional spatial strategy document that covered a whole range of policies. And the response from the local authority was always, well, we comply here definitely with 16 out of 20 policies, therefore we are in general conformity with the regional strategy. And that put the matter to rest. However, here, uniquely, there is one policy, simply one policy, and only a few words, and a key diagram. And it has to be in general conformity with that. The situation is, as I've set out in my hearing statement, it is not in general conformity with the regional strategy. And I'm not going to repeat those points here. They're quite clearly stated. You then come to section 33A, which is the duty to cooperate, and again, I've addressed the issues about the consideration of alternatives approaches to the Greenbelt and the lack of evidence that has not been addressed in that process. And then finally you come to section 39.2, which is that the plan should attempt to achieve sustainable development. And that I have set out in paragraph 6 of my hearing statement, but having had the benefit of the wisdom of leading counsel, I would add to that in this way, that in trying to achieve patterns of sustainable development, it must at least mean there is a requirement to support the objectives of the MPPF in that regard. And in that regard, I refer specifically to paragraph 84, which goes back to the whole issue of the nonsense about coalescence with neighbouring settlements that has been put forward by the council in this plan. So, sirs, I am quite clear, based on that and my discussions with council, that this plan does not comply with the legal requirement, and that is a matter for you to make a judgment on. And I have made my decision, and I intend to see it through. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wright. I'm happy that I've given you the opportunity to speak there. Sorry, I almost didn't. Does the council like to respond to Mr. Wright's points there on?
Well, one, he's wrong with respect. Y1 as saved requires the council, requires a York City Council to define the detailed boundaries of the green belt. It is, as I indicated some time ago, only a general indication. So to show general conformity with a policy which is only setting out indicative boundaries and requires the detailed boundaries to be defined through the local plan has to be approached that way. The views of the draftsman of the policy are irrelevant. The policy is to be interpreted objectively according to the words which have been used, and indeed it has been said at highest judicial level that the views of the draftsman of a policy are possibly the worst approach you could adopt to interpretation. But in any event, the words mean what they say, and that is to leave the detailed decisions to the authority. We have set out our reasons for justification of the green belt boundary through the plan and through the SA, and there is topic paper 1 and the addendum in particular, March 2019, which goes through the green belt definition process, and I'll give you the reference because I mentioned it earlier without the reference. It's EXCYC 18. Section 4 deals with the strategic approach to the green belt, beginning at page 11. And although, of course, the purpose to preserve the setting and special character of historic towns is a key one in the case of York, for all the reasons I rehearsed in opening, that cannot allow you to ignore, as this representation with respect seeks to do, that there are other policies and other purposes in the NPPF which are also relevant. They may not be the key issue, as is the preservation of the setting of York, but each of those other purposes is considered issue by issue, pages 14 to 20 of TP1 addendum, and you'll find the preventing neighbouring towns merging into one another, purpose 2 in the NPPF, is at pages 15 to 16. And I made other points earlier about what GB1 itself says, which refers to purposes in the general sense other than the special purpose relating to the preservation of York. In my respectful submission, there's nothing in this objection, and it simply ignores, firstly, the non-prescriptive wording of the RSS, and secondly, the nature of national policy with which this plan must comply.
You say there, Mr. Irving, non-prescriptive. Policy C1, though, does give some measure of prescription,
yes,
though, doesn't it?
Yes, but that has been generally followed in the way that you know, about 6 miles, and those matters have all been looked at. But they don't prescribe specific boundaries. The general guidance has been followed.
Mr. Ray, would you like to come back on that?
So the boundary goes at 7.3 miles. The total area of the greenbelt proposed in the plan is 38% larger than it was specified in PPG2 in 1988, when the Secretary of State, for the one and only time, indicated the extent of the general extent of the greenbelt. And so far as coalescence is concerned, the point is that there was previously a policy in to prevent coalescence with neighbouring villages. That was taken out by the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State has constantly informed both North Yorkshire and York that greenbelt shouldn't be used as a policy to try to control development in rural spaces. And in fact, Michael Heseltine, when he first was confronted with this approach by these councils, said that that approach was undermining greenbelt policy nationally, and the approach that is taken here continues to do that. It is quite clear that the inner ring shown on the RSS map is outside the built-up area. The proposal is for substantial areas within that ring to be made part of the York Greenbelt. That is not in conformity by any plain understanding of what is shown.
Thank you. There's clearly a degree to what is in conformity and what's not, and I suppose that's for us to look at in terms of that issue and that matter.
Yes, thank you once again, Mr. Elving.
Yes.
Well, I've set out our position, and it's your judgment, is what I meant. That's just short answer, not I'm passing the buck back to you.
I know.
Is there anybody else? Oh, Mr. Anderson, is that your? Is it? Yeah. Anybody else wishing to speak? No. Sorry, there was a card up there. Yes. Thank you. If there's nothing else further to add on those matters, then I think we can move on. I think that's okay. Thank you. So now we come on to the question 110, which is Habitats Regulations Assessment, and the update which has been produced, and the accordance with the relevant regulations on that. Again, there's a number of questions there. If I could ask the council to set out initially, it's once the relevant people are, is a shift change. Yeah, I see that. I'll allow you to get into place. But we'll invite the council to make its statement on the Habitat Regulations Assessment, HRA, from now on. And setting out the relevant sub-questions of that, A, B, C and D of 110. And then